Hey everybody, welcome back again. This time we'll be looking at the 20th century through sort of a different lens than we have so far. We've talked a lot about politics, culture, wars, economics, but we haven't particularly looked at the environment at all. And one way of doing history is looking at environmental history. It's sort of its own subfield. And the 20th century is really unique in that all of this stuff is happening that's so easy to trace. And you can talk about the environmental history of the 20th century um, in a really clear way, just because we have so much evidence and it's something that you'll definitely notice and will affect your lives. So, Something New Under the Sun is kind of a clever title to that chapter that you guys read, looking at environmental history 20th century. So, like I was saying, we've looked at all these sort of political, economic, cultural changes in the 20th century, new nation states, all that sort of stuff. But we can also evaluate it sort of from the perspective of human beings' interaction with the environment. And if we do that, we can really get a sense of how quickly the world around us is changing and how quickly the basic human experience and the way we relate to nature is changing as well. So first, we're going to look at the 20th century sort of environmental changes that did occur. Then we're going to look at this term, the Anthropocene, give you a sense of what that means when we kind of get there if you haven't heard it before. Then we'll look at the sort of damage that has been done and the sort of hope for the future, particularly what we can imagine as different or who might be helping with those sorts of processes. So let's look at the 20th century environmental transformations. What sort of things were changing? This is a kind of a complex problem, but in some ways really straightforward. So arguably, the natural environment changed more in the 20th century than in all of recorded human history. That will shortly be passed up by the 21st century, as we're already making more rapid changes and sort of deeper changes. But during the 20th century, the way human beings relate to the environment just completely changed. We can look at this a number of ways, but one way to look at it is through economic growth, which gets us sort of into the Industrial Revolution. And we talked about before, the Industrial Revolution can best be understood as sort of human beings switching from a world that was powered by plants and animals and ultimately the sun to a world that was powered by machines using oil, right, which is sort of a fossilized sunlight. But we can look at the sort of long-term changes now that we're into the 20th century and sort of understand what they look like. So here you have a graph showing a sort of world GDP, a sort of trying to capture how much economic activity was taking place everywhere in the world. It's also graphed alongside population. Those two things are deeply connected. Obviously, the more people you have, the more work can be done, right? So the world economy around 1990 was maybe 150 times bigger than the world economy in 1500. Now that's an incredible change. Part of that is due just to a lot more people. We'll get to that in a second. Part of that was due to the Industrial Revolution and just a whole new way to engage in work. And part of that was due to a sort of changing relationship between human beings, work, and the environment around them. And you'll notice on this graph that most of those changes take place in the second half of the 20th century. So we were just looking at decolonization, that period after World War II. That's when people all over the world are going to start to get in touch with industrialization and the sort of advances of the modern period, the technological advances, but also farming advances and other things we'll look at. So pretty much everything that human beings do for a job counts as economic activity, right? And everything that people do that changes the environment sort of counts as economic activity. If you cut down a tree, right, to engage in logging, you are changing the environment, and you're doing that for the sake of having wood to be able to make a house. If you drive your car to work, you're burning gas, right? That's part of the economic activity you're engaged in. So the sort of relationship between using resources, having resources, getting resources, and work are really deeply tied together. I said that population plays a huge role in this, and that's true. More hands just means more work, but more people also means more consumption of resources. So these things are really locked together. And people get sort of population wrong all the time. A lot of people just sort of assume, yeah, there's more people and stuff. Sure, that's natural. But they're not really thinking of the sort of scale of it. So in this graph, it shows the population from about 1,000 up till 2,000 and then like a slight projection to 2050. So you can see like 1,000, 11, 12, 1,300. The population around the world is actually pretty flat. They're kind of right under 1 billion people. Then with the discovery of the New World, right, by the American, with the sort of Columbian Exchange, the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, and vice versa, the population starts to go up with those Columbian Exchange, right? More food, more resources. But then after about 1950, boom, the population just jumps way up, right? This will never happen again. If this happens again, there would be simply too many people on Earth to feed. So this is sort of a one-time deal. It's hard to say whether we'll kind of level off on population or if we'll crash back down overall over the next couple hundred years. It's really tricky. But this kind of can't happen again. The projections on this sort of exponential growth would have hundreds of billions of people on the planet if something like this happened again, which wouldn't really be sustainable. Not that we're at a sustainable level now. So in about 1800 is when you hit 1 billion people on the planet, right? So it took but only about 100,000 years to get 100 billion people. 200 years later, you're looking at 6 billion people. So the population on the planet increased by 6 times over 200 years. Then 20 years later, you've added 2 billion people more. So you can see the population speed is rapidly increasing. But again, that can't hold out forever. So just like with economic activity and a lot of the things we're going to see, most of this growth is in the second half of the 20th century. After industrialization is basically everywhere in the world, after decolonization, after World War II, or after decolonization starts. Also, more and more and more of these people are living in cities. You start to get massive urbanization after about 1850 and 1900. Globally, you get massive increases in urbanization mostly at the end of the 20th century. In fact, it's only 2008 that half of the world's population lives in cities, which is kind of crazy. So for most of human history, right, most people lived in rural environments, farming environments. Otherwise, there just wouldn't have been food. But now that farming is all industrialized, you can have far fewer farmers producing food for millions and millions and millions of people who primarily live in cities. So really in your lifetime, you were alive when that happened, when the majority of human beings were living in cities versus farms or in rural environments. But when I was born, that wasn't true, for example, right? When your parents were born, that wasn't true. So kind of a crazy trend. Here you go. Where is this city? Well, the answer is kind of, it doesn't matter. More and more and more all over the world, places look just like this. This happens to be in Tokyo, looking one particular direction, but it could very easily be in Brazil. It could very easily be in the United States. It could very easily be in China, anywhere really. So more and more you're seeing stuff like this. And it's not just in developed places, whatever that might mean. And in fact, in developed places, you see kind of an opposite thing happening in some cases. So this is showing the population in 1950, 1975, 2000, and then projections for 2025. So if you look at London, for example, you'll see the population was actually highest in 1950. By 1975, the population's down. 2000, it's kind of coming back up. Maybe in 2025, it'll be about the same as it was in 1950. But if you look at a place like Cairo, Egypt, the population, this is in terms of millions, has gone through the roof. New York, right, going way up. Look again at Mexico City, right, or Lagos, Nigeria, or Shanghai, Bombay, right? Bombay is now Mumbai, right, the name change. Or Sao Paulo in Brazil. Tokyo has been a big city for a long time. but look at it now, it's like way, way bigger. So these urban environments are just massively increasing in size, but not everywhere. In fact, a lot of European cities that are big cities, London, Paris, the actual urban population is staying pretty much the same. So a lot of this is happening in what used to be thought of as the third world or the developing world, basically places outside of the United States, Europe, the Soviet Union, right? A lot of this growth in China, as you know, India, as you know, right? So all of these people doing all of this economic activity are using a lot more energy. So this is a sort of graph attempting to get a hold of global energy consumption from about 1830 up till today, or close to today. And if you look, it's really interesting because certain types of energy are coming on, like they didn't used to exist. So if you go back to 1830, almost everything was biomass or biofuel, meaning I want to heat my house, I cut down a tree, that's biofuel, right? And then I burn it, it's biomass. And then you start to get coal coming on, right, with the Industrial Revolution. Then you start to see oil coming on, then natural gas, then a little bit of nuclear. And then right at the end, you start to get solar, wind, geothermal, other things like that. But what you'll notice is energy consumption for all of these avenues is just going through the roof. Coal and oil in particular are really highly used, but also natural gas, right? So all the main forms of fuel are fossil fuels, but even biomass actually has gone way up, right, in terms of the number of joules produced, the amount of energy produced. So consumption is just up across the board. People are still using wood to heat their houses, but biomass is used in all kinds of other ways as well. So energy consumption is just really, really rapidly growing. Another way to look at this is to think about where this consumption is coming from in sort of percentages. So if you look at 1830 again, the amount of energy is pretty small and almost all of it is from biomass. But then if you jump forward to today, you can see on a sort of graph like how much is each type. So you have that bottom blue section is coal, then oil, then natural gas. So you have to get way up there to even get to other stuff. Renewables are barely even on here, right? You can barely find them. That being said, generating electricity, right? Solar is now the cheapest way to generate electricity, but there's a reason we're not doing so much of it, right? Anyhow, here you go, annual electricity net generated in the world. So you can see renewables are getting a bigger and bigger slice of the pie because they're now cheaper than anything else. So if you have, in particular, solar generation is quite cheap once you have all the infrastructure. But fossil fuels still make up the biggest bulk by far. So a lot of people don't really spend their time thinking about this. There's a light on in my room. There's a computer that I'm using. Where's all the electricity come from that's making these things? Well, here in the southeast, somewhere not too far away, people, actually machines, are shoveling coal into big furnaces, and coal is being burnt to make heat. That heat is making steam. That steam is driving turbine engines that generate the electricity. So even though I don't see it, for my energy use, somewhere fossil fuels are being burned. And I don't see the pollution that comes from that either, right, necessarily. It's pretty different than a car where I put gas in it and then my gas runs out, I can tell I'm burning gas. We have access to lots of electrical things, but we don't really think about what's happening to produce that electricity, right, most of the time. Aside from the sort of energy use and population, another story in the 20th century is about the amount of land under cultivation or used for pasture. So this is two different maps, one in 1700 in the top, and then at the bottom in 2000, showing the sort of percentage of land under cultivation. So in 1700, most of the Americas, for example, wasn't being cultivated. It wasn't under agricultural practice, or at least not super intensely. The same is true for Central Africa, the same is true for parts of India and China. But if you look at today, you can see the sort of red is like a really dense cultivation, more than 90% of the land. In places like India and the Midwest, places like Argentina, Southeast Asia, are just really, really heavily cultivated. So you might think, oh, well, good. That means we're growing more plants, right, in those areas. But it's not exactly that way. So beginning in 1900, you start to see harsher and harsher sort of agricultural practices. Um, there's new tractors. There's all kinds of, there's a thing called a disc tractor. There's all kinds of new plows that allow for land that could never really be cultivated before to be cultivated. And that produces more food, which is great, but more food produces more people, more, all these sorts of things. So it does cause its own set of problems. Then in the 1950s and 60s, there was a green revolution. And this is a bit tricky. It doesn't mean what you think it means. If you've heard of like the Green New Deal or whatever, green now means environmentally friendly. But the Green Revolution in the 50s and 60s meant a sort of transformation in the way agriculture was done. And there was a big change in the chemical industries around the world. And chemical producers like Dow and DuPont realized they could make a lot of artificial fertilizers, they could make hybrid plants and pesticides, and they could mechanize all of the sort of agricultural industry. And this allowed for the same amount of land to produce lots more food. So here's a graph showing from 1960 up to 2009 or 2010, the amount of food you can produce on a section of land, a hectare. So if you look, that black line in the middle shows the world average. You got the United States, China, India, and then the middle of Africa kind of on the bottom there. So for the United States, for example, the amount of cereals, that just means grains like rice, wheat, millet, stuff like that, and vegetables in the United States goes through the roof, right? So the amount that we can produce on one crop of land, instead of being like 2 tons per hectare in 1960, now we're producing 6.5 tons on that same hectare. So 3 times as much food coming out of the same amount of land. Well, how do you do that? That's crazy. Well, you have agricultural practices that people have been doing for, hundreds of years, thousands of years, and then you take new machines to make all of that labor easier, and then you take new fertilizer to make that soil richer, and then when the plants are growing, you spray them with pesticides to kill off any bugs. You harvest them at the correct time more quickly due to mechanization, so you can just produce way more food. So that's really good, right? You can produce more food, you can feed more people. But the problem is, we've never not had enough food to feed people. That's kind of the myth. There's plenty of food. It's all more about distribution. Every year, the US throws away millions of pounds of food that people never even make it to market, never even make it to a table. Either because nobody buys it or because it goes bad before someone eats it or whatever. So it's not necessarily about producing more food, it's about getting that food to people once it's produced. But this sort of green revolution allowed for this massive increase in the amount of food that could be produced on land, and that caused a sort of economic boom in places that could do this. If you make way more food than you eat, you can sell that food to other people. This also allows for more urbanization. Remember, if you live in a city, you're not growing food. So you have to rely on someone else to grow your food for you. So if people on the farm can grow 3 times as much food, that means way more people can live in the city and not farm for themselves. Then something real weird happens. In 1994, the first GMO products are available in stores. Here you go, here is a tomato. This was one of the first GMO foods. Genetically modified organisms is what that stands for. So these are foods where scientists have taken a gene from another fruit, vegetable, animal, plant, whatever, and spliced it into the genetic material of this new plant. In this case, they were splicing together different genes from different tomatoes to try and make a red tomato that held its shape and didn't go bad very quickly. So this one that was released in '94, had this really nice red color, and it was shelf stable for a long time. Meaning you could pick it at the farm, you could put it in the crate, you could get it to the store, and you could sell it, and it wouldn't get like bruised up or anything. But it didn't have a lot of flavor. So at first it wasn't really popular. Now, when you buy a tomato, unless you're buying organic food, which is a whole other kind of weird problem, if you just go to the store and buy a regular tomato, it doesn't really taste great. But people don't particularly care because that's what they've grown up with. If you have a chance to eat a tomato out of someone's garden, you will notice it just tastes a lot better because the ones you can grow in your garden are made to taste good. The ones you get in the store are made to sort of last longer, right? So genetically modified organisms have a bunch of known and unknown problems. One of the sort of main problems is it freaks consumers out. If people know that, oh, hey, in my vegetable, there's a piece of genetic material from a shrimp designed to make sure it has the right color, sometimes people don't like that and they don't want to buy it. Do they actually, are they bad for you? Are they unhealthy? It's really unclear. There's a lot of evidence that says they're safe to eat and all that sort of stuff. They're not going to kill you like, oh, if you eat one, it's poisonous. It's not that. But they do allow people to do other things that are really bad for the environment that people don't like. For example, there's a lot of corn that's been genetically modified so that it can't die from being sprayed with Roundup. So now corn farmers all across the Midwest, for example, as their corn is growing, they just hose the entire field with Roundup, like the chemical that people spray on their yards to kill weeds. And basically every other living thing in the field dies, except the corn, because it's been genetically modified so it can't die from that. So you're thinking, okay, cool, well, now the corn doesn't die and I can eat it. Well, one, the corn still has Roundup on it when you eat it. And since it's designed to kill everything, that might not be great. But also, those hundreds or thousands of gallons of Roundup that are being sprayed on the field get into the water, they cause all kinds of other damage. Roundup is also known to give you cancer, right? There's been a number of lawsuits about this recently. So it's tricky, right? Another major development in the 20th century that sort of changed human beings' relationship to nature in a more fundamental way, but also to the universe in sort of really big ways, is human beings are now sort of partially controlled or sort of partially in control of the atom. So beginning with World War II, there was that Manhattan Project that was the research and experimentation to build the atomic bomb. So the United States, remember, we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. We're the only ones who've ever used nuclear weapons against somebody else. But then the Soviet Union got a nuclear weapon, China, India, Pakistan, European countries. So lots of people have nuclear weapons. But it wasn't just used for weapons. There was also, immediately after the dropping of the atomic bomb, this realization that this was a tremendous, tremendous amount of energy. And science fiction writers imagined a world where that energy would be put towards constructive uses. So they wrote about things like, well, what if we wanted to make a brand new harbor? We could set off an atomic bomb on the beach somewhere and like blow out a specific ring that would become like a new harbor and like a new port instead of like doing that all by hand or with machines. So people imagine like all kinds of different uses for this. By the early 1950s, the first nuclear power plant was in operation and generating electricity. So if you've ever seen these sorts of nuclear, this is like a cooling tower, right, where the steam's coming out. Basically, nuclear power works exactly the same way as coal power in terms of what it actually does. You have a turbine, you use steam pressure to spin that turbine, and that generates electricity. But the way you get the steam, with coal power, you burn coal and boil water. With nuclear power, you have a rod of nuclear material that's, atomically speaking, really, really radioactive, really hot. You drop it into water, and it essentially immediately turns that water into steam. That steam massively expands pressure, a lot of new heat, a lot of new forces generated. That spins the turbines that create the electricity. So this seemed like a pretty cool way to generate a lot of electricity kind of cheaply, actually, and in a sort of more efficient manner than some other ways, like burning coal or whatever. And there's not a lot of environmental damage, except for one thing, which we'll get to in a second. So when you burn like coal, right, there's a lot of CO2 and other stuff entering the air. The steam that's coming out of the top of that tower is just steam. So maybe that's better. But the party kind of took a turn in the 1970s. At the end of 1970, there was a nuclear power station on 3 Mile Island in the United States where they started one of these nuclear reactions to boil the water, and they couldn't get it to stop. And so the whole reactor began to melt and like melt into the ground, and if it had continued to melt down, which is where that word comes from, it would have just totally distributed nuclear material and radioactive material all over. It would have entered the water stream, all these sorts of things. Luckily, it sort of shuts down before that happens. But you might know from Chernobyl, right? There was a great HBO series about that recently, or you might know from the Fukushima disaster, right, in Japan, that if these continue, these nuclear reactors can actually explode, distributing a ton of radioactive material into the area. And it takes a very, very long time for that material to be safe for human beings to be around again. This nuclear material and nuclear radiation is extremely harmful to human life. And this process has that sort of downside to it. In 2013, there were approximately 440 of these power plants left in 30 countries. Many places have moved away from nuclear power because of the sort of nuclear waste that is generated and the possibility of contamination, of spraying radioactive material out. On the other hand, it is the cleanest power source human beings have if we can do something about the radioactive waste, which is a huge if. It's problematic. But a lot of people oppose nuclear power because because of the fear of radiation, which is a very legitimate fear. But in terms of like comparing it to a coal plant, coal actually does a lot more immediate environmental damage, right? So what is all this adding up to? Way more people, way more economic activity, way more energy consumption. This is all kind of leading us to where we are now, and people have come up with a great name for this, the Anthropocene. I'll play a little quick video for you. It's got a nice little British voiceover, and then I can tell you more specifically what the Anthropocene means or how we might talk about it.
This is the story of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity. Never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. we are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past, we are shaping our present, we can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why they always give those sorts of things like British voiceovers, but they do. Anyway, so the Anthropocene is basically anthro, right, means human. So if you've taken like anthropology, it's like study of humanity and stuff. Anthropology, Anthropocene, is a term that people use to describe a new sort of geological age. So before there's like Holocene and other geological age. If you've done a geology class, or sometimes they talk about it in geography. So basically what the argument is since the Industrial Revolution, but much more specifically during the second half of the 20th century, human beings have come to create a brand new environment. Now this sounds kind of weird, as if human beings are controlling the whole world. How could that be? The world is very big, right? But basically, there are now so many human beings doing so much that human activity has essentially changed the way the natural environment works. So here's a nice photo to illustrate this. That's a giant mining pit. Around it are roads. On those roads, you can see like buildings, right, to show you the size of this. There's no other structure like this in nature, right? Like you think of like the the Grand Canyon or something. That took hundreds of millions of years to make. This took human beings, a couple decades. Like she was saying in that video, right? Human beings now move more of the earth every year than all the natural processes like rivers or erosion. That's crazy. The amount of concrete we produce, the amount of materials we mine, the amount of roads we build, buildings we build, all these sorts of things. We're changing the whole sort of surface of the globe. And there were never enough human beings, there was never enough mechanical energy to do this, but now there is. Human beings are changing the way the world works at a very, very fundamental level. And that might require us to rethink how we see the role of human beings within nature, or our relationship to technology, our sort of responsibility within a broader world. So if we are now living in a new age where essentially human beings control the environment, and I don't mean we control it like we can choose to not have a hurricane, but I mean where we are doing things that are changing it, it might call into question our ideas about responsibility or what we're even capable of. So for most of human history, people had the idea, and this is true in almost every culture around the world, that the Earth's resources were essentially infinite and inexhaustible. If you cut down all the trees where you live, just go somewhere else. And in fact, a number of societies fail because they did exactly that. They cut down all the trees around them. They didn't have any more wood for fuel, and societies failed. But the idea remained. The Earth was so big, for most of human history, people had no idea how expansive the Earth was or whatever, right? So this led to a sort of thinking, what people might call a sort of anthropocentric view of the world. So again, anthro means human, pocentric means focused on. So like a human-centered view of the world, which was essentially that Earth exists to benefit mankind. And you're familiar with a lot of stories like this. Like if you read Genesis, right? in the Torah or the Old Testament. Basically, it says God created the universe and Earth, and specifically for human beings to use, right? And human beings had control over it. And this is true in a number of traditions, not just Christianity and Judaism. Islam believes this as well. A lot of religions do, and even beyond religions, it's also just part of a general way of thinking that human beings are sort of the smartest animals, the best animals. We don't really even think of ourselves as animals anymore, right? We think of ourselves as somehow different than animals, although we're not. But basically, humans are sort of master of nature. And in a sense, we've gotten to the point where we don't even really think we need it, right? I don't need when I'm hungry, I just pull up through Chick-fil-A and I get it. I don't know, whatever you get, and I drive home and I eat it. Actually, I don't really go to Chick-fil-A that much, but whatever, doesn't matter. So there I am. I got my chicken sandwich, and I don't need to think about on a farm someone grew wheat so that I could have a bun, or on a farm someone raised a chicken so that I could have this chicken. I don't have to be connected to nature like that at all. I don't go to a farm and have someone slaughter a pig for me, right? I just don't. I go to Kroger's and I buy a pork chop if I want it, right? So this is tremendously different. Most people who grow up in cities just have no idea how nature works in that respect. They're just not part of it, and it doesn't need to be part of their daily lives. And this is very sort of strange and confusing from the sort of standpoint that we are animals, because animals are deeply tied into nature, right? They revolve around it, and we do too. We just kind of think we don't. That's problematic, and that sort of leads to a lot of the exploitation of nature that we've seen. So what a lot of people, again, from religious faiths or from philosophical stances, or people that are concerned about these issues have argued is that human beings need to sort of change the way they see nature. Right now, some people argue, this is kind of the way that most people see nature, particularly Americans, right? You got men on top, and then below that you got like women and whales, and then below that you got like pigs, dogs, cows, and then on down. When I show this in class, I always get a pretty good laugh. Hopefully you guys are digging it back there too, wherever you are. Tied into this sort of idea that human beings rule the earth is also that men rule women and that they're sort of, superior. These tend to go hand in hand. The more likely you are to believe that like men are just superior to women or whatever, you're also probably likely to believe that human beings are superior to the rest of nature, that you don't really need nature or whatever. It's not a very nurturing sort of view. Anywho, what people are arguing is we need to kind of re-examine nature like this. Maybe instead of a sort of hierarchical chart that have human beings at the top and then like smart animals like whales and dolphins and stuff, and then like animals that are important like dogs or cows, and then like eventually down to like stuff we don't care about, maybe we need to think about nature from the perspective that everything matters, or everything is sort of equally important, at least in terms of how nature functions. If we continually try to rework nature to suit human beings, as we have been doing for quite some time, it might cause trouble in terms of our relationship to the rest of life around us. And it may even eventually make it less habitable for us sort of in the environment we live in. At the very least, human beings should start to understand that we rely on nature and not the other way around. You might hear environmentalists talk about how the earth is in trouble and stuff like that. That's garbage. The earth's not in trouble at all. It's human beings that are in trouble, right? The earth's going to go merrily on if we destroy ourselves. So, okay. So, if we're thinking about the Anthropocene and human beings changing nature, what sort of changes have we done? What sort of damage has been done? And what sort of hope is out there? Or what signs do we have for a better future? What changes could we make? First, it is important to sort of try to get a grasp of What's gone wrong? Most of this is all unintended consequences. We didn't know when we were building giant cities or when we were engaging in, industrial practices, what we were doing by and large. Obviously, many corporations and industries know they're polluting and stuff like that, but that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the sort of broader changes to the world that have happened as a result of those practices. We need to sort of figure out what those are. So we can get little hints of this here and there. For example, we can look at pollution and smog. Here's a nice picture of London, right? So people have burned things for a long time. Basically, as long as there have been, I mean, human beings didn't always have fire, but for quite a long time, let's say 100,000 years or so, human beings have been burning things pretty regularly to cook food, to stay warm, as part of hunting, right? All kinds of stuff. But with the Industrial Revolution, we not only changed what we burned, but how frequently. So instead of burning wood or grass or cow manure or something like that, human beings are now burning fossil fuels. We're igniting things at much higher temperatures, and we're burning things that result in a number of strange byproducts. For example, when you burn plastic, we might not want to be too close to the fire, right? But before there were lots of plastics, we just couldn't do that. So the Industrial Revolution has really changed what we burn, how frequently. And during the last 100 years in particular, air quality has really transformed around the world. There's a much higher level of CO2, but there's also a number of other pollutants in the air that are quite dangerous for people, and at some points, and in some locations, has been really horrible. Smog, for example, like this, first appeared in London around the factories. You may have heard of the London fog. That's a euphemism, right? When they show like old Sherlock Holmes movies or something, there's like always like fog in the streets of London. That's a sort of weird misunderstanding, a historical misunderstanding. When people talked about the fog in London, it was smoke. So the smoke from the factories, right? And a number of respiratory conditions are on the rise and have been since that period. Here you go, this guy's wearing a gas mask. Those women are like dotting their eyes. This is in Los Angeles in the 1960s, right? So this has been going on for a while. It's not new. Many of you have probably never seen it in the sort of like horrible way it can be. I took this picture a few years ago. This was in China, and that's about 3 city blocks long, and you just couldn't see to the end of it. If you have any friends that live on the West Coast, right, there were just those really big fires over there. You can look straight up at the sun, and you just see like an orange ball. It doesn't hurt your eyes at all. It's just there's so much like stuff in the air. So, okay, so pollution, who cares, right? Well, there's lots of little weird changes that pop up. One of the first examples was moths changing color in Britain. So we can see the effect it has on nature in a strange way. In Britain, there was this species of moth that sometimes was born white, sometimes was born black. All of a sudden, after the Industrial Revolution, the white ones essentially disappear. Well, what happened to them? Well, for quite a long time, there'd been sort of 2 different variants. What happened was the ones that were white, all of a sudden, could be seen everywhere. So they got eaten by birds because there was this like layer of schmutz and stuff and the smog in the air. The white ones really stood out, whereas ones that were darker had a genetic advantage now, so they didn't get eaten as much. So the ones that were white got eaten more, and over a relatively short time, the color of these moths changed, right? There's no white ones anymore. Things like that are just a little example of the sorts of changes that we see or might not see. My guess is many of you watching have asthma. When I was a kid, in middle school and high school, there were maybe 2 or 3 people that had asthma. Everybody knew them. They had like an inhaler. It was like a really weird thing. Now, asthma rate amongst children are really high, actually. The highest it's been, for human beings. And the reason is they're growing up with crappy air quality, It's really clear. Talk to any pediatrician and they'll tell you it's not like it's not something that's made up. It's not like hard to prove. It's just easy to show. The air quality isn't as good, and children growing up in that air have more trouble breathing, overall. So these things are definitely around, and they're definitely making changes. Collectively, we might call this climate change. It began with the Industrial Revolution, but it's really accelerated after about 1950. Again, that sort of great acceleration they talked about. And it's just because human beings have been producing so much more of these sort of so-called greenhouse gases. The way it works is just like a greenhouse, right? Sunlight can come through the carbon dioxide, right? Because light can move through this layer of carbon dioxide really easily. But when light hits the ground and turns into heat, that heat evaporating back off like towards space can't get back out through the CO2. So the heat's sort of trapped in. So the more CO2 in the air, the more heat you trap on Earth, the warmer Earth gets. This is not contested. This is not hard to understand. It's not made up. It's really easy to demonstrate. But you are probably also aware, and some of you probably don't believe in climate change, that's okay. There is a large push to try to show that climate change is not real. If you believe that, or if you've seen that, you might want to wonder who is telling me it's not real and why. It's not the scientists who study this stuff. They're crystal clear on all this, and they don't make any money off it. However, big companies like Exxon are saying it doesn't exist, right? And politicians who get paid by big companies like Exxon are saying it doesn't exist. Anywho, you can calculate just over time. Human beings have been keeping records. For example, there's a astronomy outpost, essentially, an astronomical observatory in Hawaii on one of the top of the volcanoes that measures the amount of CO2 in the air and has been since the late 1950s. So this graph shows those measurements over time, the number of parts per million of CO2 in the air. And you can just see over the last 40 years, just incredible rise, right? Or you could look at the sort of mean land and ocean data in terms of the amount of CO2 that's in the ocean or in the air, right? Over the last 150 years or so, right? Smoothed out. Or you could look in like really, really big time over the last 500,000 years. So you have this like nice wave pattern sort of for the amount of CO2 in the air. And at the sort of crest of this last wave right around here, oh, yellow, that doesn't work very well. Right around here, that doesn't work very well either. How about black? Let's try that. Yeah, okay, right around here. Now let me erase those so you can actually see it. You'll notice that there's a huge sort of change, right? Where that crest was supposed to come back down, it doesn't. It goes right back up. So at least in the last 650,000 years, there's never been this much CO2 in the air. You have to go back to the time when the crust wasn't fully cooled on the Earth in a lot of places, and there's like volcanoes spewing all the time to get as much CO2 as we have now. And if you look just in the last 50 years, that level is going almost straight up. The increase is exponential. There is no other reason for it than human activity. When you burn things, you put more CO2 in the air. When you drive a car, when you have your lights on, whatever, it's just what happens. So this is tricky because we're heating up the world. And it's not a ton. It's like a degree or two at a time over, the last couple hundred years. But it has major sorts of consequences. And it causes all kinds of feedback loops. For example, a few degrees change in the heat leads to more ice melting. That ice actually had a lot of CO2 in it and methane that's now released into the atmosphere, and that traps more heat. Also, that ice that was white used to reflect more light straight back out into the universe away from Earth, and so it didn't heat it up. But now that it's gone, that light hits the ocean where it's turned into heat, right, instead of bouncing back out. So there's all these sorts of feedback loops. And what people are worried about, what the majority of scientists working on these issues are worried about, is that we may hit a tipping point where we can't change our behavior and get the world to kind of go back to where it was. So for now, the hope is that human beings can either develop new sources of energy or change their behaviors or something, and we can sort of go back. But it might be that we eventually can't. At the same time that there's that sort of broader spectrum of climate change that a lot of people don't take so seriously because they can't see it every single day, there's also other stuff going on, like the mass extinction of animals. So in the Anthropocene, we've also begun a new era of mass extinction. Like these little cuties here. These were the last two black rhinos. When I originally made these slides for classes a few years ago, they still were alive. They're no longer alive. So the African black rhino is now gone, just like that. So animals are currently going extinct somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 times the normal background rate. So animals, as you know through maybe your studies in biology classes or evolution, right? Animals go extinct all the time. And if you look at the fossil record, there's a totally different set of animals than there are today, right? And that's completely normal. However, in normal times, there's a specific sort of rate to that. And then you can see like huge sort of mass extinction events. You might know the dinosaurs, right? A lot of the dinosaurs die out when there's a sort of massive meteor strike that cools the earth for a while. And that's a mass extinction event. We're living through another one. Only this time, human beings are the cause of it. Literally, and this is not like some weird hyperbole, this is like a fact. About every day, a species goes extinct, which is just sort of mind-boggling. And most of the time, it's not things that we care about in any kind of way. So if a type of fungus goes extinct, or if a certain type of fruit fly goes extinct, or whatever, you probably don't care. And we're not really even aware of it. But the best projections are somewhere between 30 and 50% of all species living on the planet right now will be extinct by 2050. That's just an amazing, sort of shocking thing to even say in your lifetime. So in your lifetime, and not even like, by the time you're my age, 30 to 50% of the species that are alive right now won't be, if things are continuing. So it's clear that 99% of this sort of speed up in the extinction is caused by human activity, particularly our economic activity, our population. Whenever we plow down a section of forest or grassland to make new suburbs or something, we're getting rid of other places where animals can live. And this is really problematic because we don't always know how these animals interact with nature. And we've had a lot of problems with this. Sometimes animals do a lot of good things for the world around us, and then when we get rid of them, we have to all of a sudden engage in other ways to try to get rid of them, the problems that result. So, for example, in a lot of places, we got rid of all the wolves, right? Because we don't like wolves. They kill cows and sheep. Maybe they also are kind of scary. But in places where you get rid of wolves, now there's way too many deer, and so the deer eat the crops, or they're a nuisance. Even if you allow hunters to hunt them regularly, it doesn't particularly matter. They can't do as good a job as wolves, right? And wolf packs do. So there's things like that. But also, we tend to only sort of care about big things we can see. So you might care about these black rhinos. You might be like, oh man, that's really sad, right? But you're less likely to care about some amoeba that you've never heard of. But that amoeba might have a particular role in nature that, is important, or just as a species has a sort of right to exist, right? So let me play you this video about Lonesome George, and you can kind of get a sense of some of the other things that are happening. And it sort of begs a really interesting question. Lonesome George was a tortoise. He was so named because he was the last of his species. If human beings keep killing all the rest of the animals, pretty quickly there'll just be a time when there's not a lot of other animals around. Uh, and so human beings might end up feeling a bit lonely in this sort of natural world we're creating. But anyway, let's take a look at Lonesome George and you can hear about him.
Lonesome George, the giant tortoise, caught people's attention when he was first brought out of the wild and into captivity. People were sad that he was the only member of his species. As a scientific community, we had hoped that there was more time with him as we were thinking about other ways to try to get him to produce offspring. He never really found much interest in the females that were brought in to be attractive to him. He had a relationship with the individuals who took care of him over decades in the tortoise breeding center on Santa Cruz in the Galapagos. And when he died in June of 2012, they were devastated. The American Museum of Natural History was chosen by the Galapagos and by the government of Ecuador to prepare this individual specimen because we're world-renowned in our taxidermy and our ability to create amazing lifelike forms.
The difference between preparing a specimen such as Lonesome George versus if we were just preparing a Galapagos tortoise is that the world knew Lonesome George. Not only does this need to be a scientifically accurate piece, but it also needs to be George. Once I started creating the sculpture of George, I had the pose the way I wanted, and there's that critical point where now I need the input from the scientific department.
With the skin, have you actually checked to see whether this neck length is looks like it's correct now?
Yes. As you're creating a piece that you're trying to make scientifically accurate, there's a point where the artist takes over and you want to just create this grand piece and fix things and make it a little bit flamboyant and add an extra hand of the artist in there. The scientist has to hold back and keep in check what's completely accurate. I think it's a struggle at times, but I think there's a point where the two come together and just mesh perfectly.
He's really come out so well. There's that real sense of movement. I love these big giant legs you get at the back of these tortoises. I mean, that's where all the power and the weight is. It's so important that we have the opportunity to conserve him so that people can actually experience him. If you think about other species that have gone extinct like the dodo, the fact that there are no intact specimens anywhere, you know, whatever you see in a museum is an artificial recreation, it's a model. But here we have the whole Lonesome George. This is his shell, his skin. You feel like you're right now, you know, standing right next to a living, live giant tortoise.
Unfortunately, all of the giant tortoises in the Galapagos are at risk of extinction. We used to consider them as all one or a couple of species, and now that we're more aware that there are a number of species, we need to maintain them as separate species and ensure that we manage them as distinct units into the future. There used to be giant tortoises across the world, and now there are only two different groups left, one of them in the Galapagos and the other one in Aldabra. I actually think since Lonesome George touched so many lives that it's critical for us to have a specimen that people can relate to. I think he is an iconic representative of human use of resources right now in the world. People can go and see this amazing organism that no longer walks the face of the earth and reflect on what we can do better in the future.
Okay, so yeah, it's like now if you want to see him, you got to go to a museum. In the future, when you take your kids to the museum, there's going to be stuff in there that you remember seeing or that was alive when you were a kid. And that's pretty crazy. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are people out there doing good things and trying to make a difference. And we can look at some of these people and try to understand what they did and what their fight was about. And it might help inform some of our decisions or help us see the possibility for hope that's going on in these events. So someone we might look at is Rachel Carson. She was an aquatic biologist for the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and she started to realize that there was a big problem with bird eggs and sort of creek environments around the country. In particular, there was a new chemical pesticide that was being used all over the country in the 30s, 40s, 50s in particular, called DDT. And she began to see and to take great notice of the fact that DDT, well, it was great for killing bugs, was completely destructive to bird and reptile eggs, and was lingering in water and soil long after it was used, and seemed to be causing health problems in human beings. Now, DDT was excellent for killing fleas, lice, bed bugs, and it was hailed as a sort of miracle for preventing, worms from eating crops and all these sorts of things. However, Carson sort of blew the lid on the fact that it wasn't safe. Now, in the 50s, the companies that were making DDT tried really, really hard to show that it was safe and great. Here was a model from the time. This really famous bikini model is here. She's in her bikini, she's eating a hamburger, she's drinking a Coke, getting sprayed with DDT. And this was from like a Life magazine or something showing how DDT was totally safe. And around the world, governments would pay to just have trucks and stuff just drive through the streets, just spraying this stuff through public housing or through areas that were determined to be infected. And it really did help with all kinds of things, like fleas and bed bugs again, right? Or like infestations in people's homes, all that sort of stuff. But it was just absolutely horrible for the environment. In fact, Rachel Carson dies of breast cancer from exposure to DDT. And it was her work with it that exposed her to these things. And it was absolutely horrible for people. It leads to all kinds of problems. It's now illegal to use. But her attempts to get it banned, she went before Congress, she testified, she wrote books. In 1962, she published a very, very famous book called Silent Springs that sort of kickstarted the health and environmental sort of movement in the US. One of the sort of things from her book about eating food, right, is you should eat food that does go bad, just eat it before it does. So if that processed cheese in your refrigerator will never mold, it probably means maybe you shouldn't be eating it. It's probably not good for your health. On the other hand, you should be eating apples. Just make sure you eat them before they mold, right? But she also argued that synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, things that were not really well tested, were damaging the environment, and that the U.S. government should be more careful about these sorts of things and regulating them. And it really kickstarted a lot of those conversations leading into the 70s with Richard Nixon making the Environmental Protection Agency and stuff like that. Which, strangely, he was a Republican, right? Made the first Environmental Protection Agency. So interesting there. We might look at other people, like Wangari Maathai. She's a really interesting person to look at in terms of trying to undo some of this damage. She was born in 1940 in Kenya. She passed a little bit ago, but had a nice long life there. She came to the US to study biology. She got her master's in biology from the University of Pittsburgh. She went back to Nairobi and became a science professor. And she started to realize that in Kenya, there was a big problem with deforestation, and that there also seemed to be a connection between deforestation, denying indigenous people of their rights, and denying women of their rights. So she looked around and would see this in the countryside. Remember, her specialty was biology. And often you didn't just get deforestation, people would be displaced. And she began to argue that what Kenya really needed was a holistic approach to ending deforestation, and that started with women. If women had more rights, they would have a bigger voice in conservation and would be more conservative about their sort of views of the world, and would want to protect the nature around them for their families and for their communities. And so she began to organize women to practice, to vote, to have more democratic rights, and to think more deeply about ecology, and to try to plant community gardens, try to reforest areas that had been slashed and burned or logged out, and end really aggressive agriculture or foresting practices. Well, actually, this turned out to be a really big threat to the Kenyan government, because whenever you try to mobilize more people to exercise their political rights, that can be very threatening to governments, especially if they repress those people. Also, remember, logging and agriculture are economic activities. And so what she was calling for was a more thoughtful approach to logging and agriculture, and encouraging people to resist big ag and big, logging. And the Kenyan government tried desperately to stop her, but couldn't necessarily do so. And her movement gained a lot of speed and sort of kickstarted an environmental movement in Kenya. In 2004, she actually became the first African woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. And this connection of women's rights and environmentalism, particularly coming out of Africa, is really powerful, because those links are often ignored. In a more democratic society, you have less abuses, not just of human beings, but also of nature. And her work really kind of demonstrates that. Another person you might look at trying to sort of change the future is Elon Musk. You might actually be familiar with this guy. I'm not sure if he's like a hero or if he's going to turn out to be a Bond villain. It's questionable right at this point. Anyway, he was born in South Africa. He came to the US to get a PhD at Stanford, dropped out, became an entrepreneur, started a couple internet-based companies. Zip2U, you guys probably haven't heard of. It's kind of a forerunner to like Google Maps, and helped newspaper deliveries and other things like that. PayPal, though, you probably have heard of. When he sold PayPal, he became, instantly very, very wealthy. In the early 2000s, became a US citizen, and started other companies like SpaceX and Tesla Motors. And his idea is that human beings shouldn't be dependent on fossil fuel, and that we need to radically change the way human beings consume energy. He also wants to go to Mars. He also wants to have tunnels underground in California and all kinds of other crazy stuff. But his energy company, Tesla, is really interesting. They make electric cars, but they also make, roofs that are electric roofs for houses, and energy storage and all kinds of other stuff that he's working on. And that might actually be more interesting for the future. In fact, the batteries that they use for the cars and stuff his company uses those for other purposes, and recently has begun an experiment on an island in the Pacific to generate all of their own electricity. So here I'll show you this little video. It's like a promo video from Tesla about what they're doing on this island for energy usage. And then we can talk about it a little bit. So that's just one island in the Pacific, quite small, that that video is about. But Tesla is also doing something similar in Western Australia, something similar in Nevada, right? The new gigafactories they run are driving a lot of their power from solar, although not exclusively, of course. So that's sort of a revolution he's imagining. So all of these different people are imagining different futures with different agricultural practices, forestry practices, energy consumption. So it's not like human beings have destroyed the environment and there's no going back. Yeah, human beings have destroyed the environment in many ways, but there's also a lot of creative people. And you can't just blame like technology and industrialization, that'll get you nowhere. But we might be able to use those tools to then undo some of the damage we've done if we kind of are focused on it at least. So during the 20th century, human beings literally transformed the natural environment and created something that had never been seen in nature before. It's bad. It's bad. If you don't believe it's bad, it doesn't matter. It is. The data continues to pile up on that. But there's also a lot of people out there doing good things, and you will be involved in that. By the time, again, you're my age, or by the time you have kids, the world might or might not look very different how it does now in terms of the environment. And a lot of that, unfortunately for you guys, will be up to you. So anyway, next time we're going to get back to looking at the sort of world in a broader sense. We had decolonization, we've thought about it in these environmental terms. So now we're going to look at like the 60s, 70s, 80s, lots of new nations, lots of new problems. We'll get into that next time. As always, let me know what questions you have. Otherwise, talk to you soon.